the speaker. Mike Feely is one of my best friends. Uh-oh, I've ruined it. I've said it already. There you go. We've many a year we had rented the same house at Lake Junaluska for conference, and our children enjoyed playing with each other and that sort of thing. And Mike is just so serious. I wish he would joke a little bit or maybe say something funny. Anyway, Mike, we're so glad to have you. He is a member of the History and Archives of Holston Conference and of the General Church of the whole United States. Member of the History and Archives Commission. Come on up here, Mike. Say something to us.
All right. Thank you, Jim, for that glowing and well thought out introduction. So, Jim also should have mentioned that we got involved by running mission teams in the same area of Mexico too. Overlapped on that for many years. So I should have done this presentation in Spanish just to make it a lot quicker. But so I'm glad to be with y'all. I work. My wife is here, Annette Spence, who's the editor of the Holston Conference Call. I always have to say that. And which was the current. This is one of the predecessor papers that we for the call, the Holston Methodist. So I'm happy to be here. We are going to move along as quick as we can. I'm mainly here to tell you to take the History of Fountain City, if you hadn't already, that's on your table, because that's one of the best histories, church histories that I've ever seen. And I don't say that just because Jim wrote it, but I do say it because it's not only well written, but it's concise. I carry a lot of books from place to place, and most historians don't write concisely, including myself. There's 300 pages and this, that, and the other, and you get back pain after carrying a lot of that stuff around. You'll have no pain reading this. It's a wonderful, well-written history, and I should say award-winning history too, because I just found out tonight. This just shows I need to talk to the folks on the committee. It hadn't been announced. Are we allowed to announce it? Okay. Well, anyway, it's an award-winning history, so we'll announce that. So I also brought a lot of stuff with me. So I share archives and history for the conference, for this jurisdiction, and I'm also on the General Church archives and history, which proves that if you're willing not to take a salary, the sky's the limit in Methodism. You can go anywhere, but I brought this front table here, with the exception of the framed preacher's license that I wanted y'all to see, an exhorter's license. I'd love for y'all to take some of those. I've got Histories of Holston Conference written by Bob Hilton. My name's in there as well. I'll autograph that for you if you want. There's also United Methodist Women's histories of different kinds. There's some other histories of Holston written by Roy Howard. There's also brochures of our of the archives, which are at Tennessee Wesleyan University in Athens. And if you ever have a chance to come down there, Athens isn't that far. I drove up from Chattanooga today, so Athens is pretty close. But love, anytime if you want to go down or bring a group or a Sunday school class, or you're just bored, or you've had a flat tire and you need to talk to somebody, call. My card's on the table as well. We'll give you a tour of the archives, and you can eat lunch at Tennessee Wesleyan for about $4. It's a deal. I don't even know why you wouldn't go down and see the archives. I also have copies of a wonderful song that has nothing to do with history, but I thought for those of y'all in the choir might be fun. There's the Circuit Rider song. I've got copies of that on the table, and also a song called Grumblers, which a lady that I knew that played the piano up in Kentucky gave this to me one time. She says, "I'm so tired of people complaining." And this song simply says this. So this is the levity before we get into the history. It says, in the country towns or cities, some people can be found who spend their lives in grumbling at everything around. Oh, yes, they always grumble, no matter what we say, for these are chronic grumblers, and they grumble night and day. Then gets to the church part, because this isn't a hymnal. It says, they grumble at the preacher, they grumble at his prayer, they grumble at his preaching, they grumble everywhere. They grumble at God's people and say it's all display, but holy folks don't grumble. They only have time to pray. Wonderful little song if you ever need that in church to lift up your spirits. I brought copies of that as well. I wanted to work that in one way or another. The other thing I brought, and I'm not giving these away, on the stage, I've got these are things from that we picked up over the years. Some of them came out of the archives in Junaluska for the jurisdiction, which now are at Emory University, and these were things that Emory wasn't going to use. So we sort of have a display archives that goes around all the time. But I've got a book here that's got a picture in it, or an engraved picture of Bishop Roberts, and y'all are celebrating your 200th anniversary of Fountain City, but last year was 200 years of the Holston Conference, and that was the bishop that sat at that first conference meeting, which was here in Knoxville. Also, a set of sermons from a Methodist Protestant minister named J.L. Ogburn, I believe, from North Carolina. He hand wrote all his sermons, and we found the book. They're from the 1840s, worth taking a look at. And this is really a cool thing for this church, or at least for history geeks like me, it's a cool thing. One of your pastors, I don't think any of y'all were here in 1838 when W.C. Graves served this congregation. I don't think this building was here at that point either. I need to read Jim's book and just verify that. But in 1838, William Carroll Graves was the minister, and there's a relation to Bishop Graves there as well, but he was the pastor here for a year. We found a file of his letters over in North Carolina. We weren't sure who he was. I looked him up, and these were written while he was here in the Fountain City area. I've got the originals here on the stage as well from 1838. He's arguing, or gently arguing. It's actually a really cool set dialogue between him and a minister named Mr. Pickrell, or maybe a layperson named Mr. Pickrell out of South Carolina, who in the 1830s, they had time to write each other 4 to 5 page letters dealing with the subjects of universal salvation and other similar subjects. They were not on Twitter. These are fairly long form documents, but I brought them so you could take a look as well. So what do? I collect stories, and that's something I love about your church. Y'all always have had, I've been coming here for years in different capacities, showing up sometimes for a free meal, preached here once or twice, or spoke here once or twice. Used to come to the they weren't called yard sales, but it was here in the gym. Y'all had all sorts of great stuff. I'd come down from Henderson Settlement, and but every time I came here, I would go look in the hall because y'all always have had the most wonderful sense of your own history. And I think that's incredibly important. I'm really worried we're in a time where folks are forgetting history. And I think I could have made that argument at almost any time in the last 200 years. It's easy to forget our history. In fact, the other day when I was looking at looking through some of the materials, I found a brochure from the Heritage Preservation Workshop in Lake Junaluska, and it had in it, it said it's 1999. Do you know where your church's history is? And this unfortunately was way too familiar. It said, could it be in ragged record books and cluttered cabinets and closets where moth and silverfish and rust doth corrupt? Could it be in Aunt Trudy's trunk, Miss Sarah's box of yellowed clippings, Phil's photo albums? Or is it in Mr. Henry's head and he's 93 years old? Or is it in a nicely bound book written in 1969 and nothing has happened since then? I can't use that here. Y'all have done, I mean, I'm basically here to say thank you for what you've done with your own history, for the displays. I mean, over the years, for all sorts of wonderful things that y'all have written, culminating in what Jim has put together with his team. So, last couple of days or last couple of months, one of the things that I do with the with archives and history is go pick up stuff from people. Unfortunately, I never thought anybody'd pay attention when we put out the word that if you've got something historical, we'd like to put it in the archives. Folks call all the time. I got a text message in the middle of a rainstorm in Dayton on the way up today, and I'm not even sure who this person is. Hopefully they're not in this room, but it was an unknown caller, and the text said, "Are you ready to receive Reverend Reagan's materials?" It sounded like a CIA plot or something like that. I was like, and I was hoping they'd follow up and say, "I'll be in the McDonald's at 3:00, waiting in the unmarked car." But we get a lot of stuff like that, and we take stuff like that to Athens. Why do we do that? You could say because we're hoarders. That would be one thing. But historically, why do we do that? For me, it is, and if you fall asleep after this, it's okay. But for me, the reason all this stuff is so important is I think everybody's voice matters. Even the ones, especially the ones I don't agree with. And there's a lot of those out there as well. but we don't want to lose anybody's voice. That includes, when we say history, not only, it's not just pastors, they're important folks, but it's lay people just as important. It's the United Women of Faith, it's the youth ministry, it's kids, it's all our institutions in Holston Conference. We don't want to lose those voices. So for the last couple of months, one of the places I've been grubbing around in, which has been kind of interesting, has been Hiawassee College. Some of y'all have a connection with Hiawassee College. It's one of our conference colleges, started by Holston in roughly the 1830s, and then found out the other day one of the first graduating classes, I had a relative. That's kind of cool, but that's another story. But when Hiawassee closed and was sold to a group called the Bruderhof, which is a really neat organization, I can tell you about that some other time. But all the materials that were in Hiawassee, the letters, the books, the library, the manuscripts, all that stuff got taken to an undisclosed location. We lost track of it. We found it. It was in an old annex for the Monroe County Sheriff's Office, which is, I guess, what happens if you don't pay your parking tickets or whatever. But anyway, but down in that annex, which is off from the courthouse, there were tons. I mean, just probably 400 different boxes of things, books. I had the time of my life. It was an unair conditioned annex. It's about 95 degrees. Monroe County gets warm in the summer. It gets warm everywhere, but it's got warm there. But myself and the archivist, the county historian for Monroe County, Brian Harrell, real neat guy, and Doc Allen. I don't know if any of y'all know Dr. Robert Allen. He's a character, but a brilliant man, really a former English teacher and archivist at Hiawassee. We've been down there 4 to 5 times. What's cool is you keep finding stories. Kind of like if you go up someone's attic and dig around, you find stories. And there may be some attics around this building that have some stories as well. But we found, for example, a box of Mrs. Estes Kefauver's hats. Some of y'all remember Senator Kefauver or know that history. We didn't find any coonskin caps. I was looking for that. But the Kefauvers, who's still the senator and his wife are buried on the family farm that's behind the Walmart, actually, in Madisonville. But there's still family there. Some of the kids and grandchildren in that area. We called them up, and the historian that was working with us from First Methodist there would come up and pick up the stuff, and we sent the hats. We sent scrapbooks that were from Senator Kefauver's office. We found all sorts of stuff. Last week we found a set of saddlebags belonging to Reverend James Axley from the 1840s, just sitting in a box there. So there's stories that we don't want to forget. That's part of what's all about in terms of history. But history is also something that gives us insights on who we are as well, both in good and bad ways. I found history. Sometimes it's not. It can be sort of grumpy history, I call it. I found a book the other day that it was in the Hiawassee materials. It was called Reflections About the Good Old Days. Y'all remember the good old days? It's always 50 years before whatever time we're talking about, the good old days. Well, I thought this would be kind of cute, and I read stuff like this all the time. Yeah, the fellow that wrote it was mad about stuff. First 20 pages, he's angry about the good old days. He's even angry about how the world's turning out now. It's one of the most depressing reads. Hopefully you're not related to the author who I won't name. History does a lot of that, but there's also the part of history that inspires us. Isaac Patton Martin, who was a pastor at this church for a number of years, wrote in 1951, in the last lines he was one of the Holston Conference historians, he wrote in his Holston history that the history of our churches, this was the last thing he wrote actually before he died, in terms of published material. He said, the history of our churches is not the dead hand of the past. It is the living spirit of courage and devotion for our day and for all days. So those stories are important. Hebrews 12:1, one of my favorite verses, says, we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. But I also believe that we, United Methodists, are surrounded by a lot of stories as well, and by a lot of really good historians. Folks like Robert Hilton, Roy Howard, I brought some of their material here. I would add Dr. Jim Dougherty to that list as well. And also some people who had interesting it was interesting how they dealt with their history. E.A. Shugart was a presiding elder in this district in the 1930s. None of y'all probably knew him, but I knew some of y'all may have known the name Mary Dean Shugart, who was his daughter-in-law. She was the vice president of the United Methodist Women for years. But E.A. Shugart was, and his son was a pastor over, and I knew them when he was retired, and I was pastoring over in White Pine at that point. And they were in my church at Seahorns Chapel. But E.A. Shugart was a proud member of the Methodist Episcopal Church South. Fountain City was part of that as well. And when we voted to merge, we being, Holston in the past, voted to merge those two conferences together, along with the Methodist Protestants, he was pretty upset about it. But I thought about this a lot during the disaffiliation battles and some of the other stuff. He was mad about merging. He didn't want to hang out with Northern Methodists, even though he lived like a block from all sorts of Northern Methodists. In Holston, you could not cross the street without running into somebody from the other Methodist side of the, and most folks got along pretty well, but Dr. Shugart didn't like that. So he was the secretary, and Tony, this may be interesting to you, but he was the secretary of the Conference Journal for about 30 years. He picked the color that the Conference Journal came in. There's only been one time in Holston history that I'm aware of. I may be wrong on this, but one or two times that the Conference Journal has been black when it's come out. But he picked that color because he wanted everybody to know that he was in mourning over Holston coming out together as a unified conference. But the cool thing was, he wrote a lot of history, but he never left. He said, okay, I've said my piece. I'm sticking with it. And he kept with it as well. So a bicentennial is a good time to reassess all sorts of things. For 200 years old, y'all look pretty young. Exception of Larry Carroll, most of y'all have not aged that much at all. But I've been thinking about this too, because not only have we come through some interesting times lately, but we've also been we've been in a place where a lot of churches, because of the timing, 1824, 1825, and certainly over the next couple of years, a lot of churches are going to be celebrating bicentennials. A few weeks ago, I was at Asbury United Methodist in Greenville, where I served at one point as an associate with Brent Hall, blessed be the name, he's aged pretty well too. But anyway, but I went back there and preached a few weeks ago, and they're celebrating their 150th year. But one of the things I talked about, because they've been through a lot of stuff as well. And I said, this is where history is so important, because when Francis Asbury, and by the way, did you know that Francis Asbury today is 280 years old? It's his birthday today. Yeah. We should have had a cake. I got to today and thought of all the things should have, could have. But anyway, if you see him or if you sing anything he might have written or sung, tell him happy birthday. 280 years. He's done pretty well. But when Asbury first came into Tennessee into the late 1700s and was hanging around Greene County and places like that, he came here as well. Tennessee wasn't an easy. It wasn't a really easy place to hang around in. People were irritated with each other. Unlike today, where Tennesseans are peaceful people, we get along with each other all the time. I thought about that as I was driving in on I-40, but Asbury walked right in. Those first conferences at Ebenezer, up at Chucky, and some of those areas, those first conferences were held right in the aftermath, or even in the middle of some of the fighting between fun-loving individuals like John Sevier and Andrew Jackson, all these people that you wouldn't want to be on either side of, but they were arguing over whether we were going to have a state of Franklin or where Tennessee belonged, all those kind of things that were going on. That was an interesting time, post-Revolutionary War in Tennessee history. When Asbury Church started up in this 1870s, 1873 or 4, I guess 1875, when it started up right at the end of a time that had been very pivotal in Tennessee history and a time of great disappointment, especially for the Northern Methodists and anybody that believed in possibly a new kind of role for our country, and that was Reconstruction. It would only be about 5 years later that we've had our first conference that would be race-based, if you will, and that was the East Tennessee Conference. The Methodist Episcopal Church, the Northern Church, in 1880, started a denomination or a part of it just for African Americans, basically. And we'll talk about that a little bit this evening. And so one of the things that history is good for is a reminder as well, to remind us that we've been through some stuff before, even when times are tough. And that's maybe why I like history. It's not that I find joy in things that didn't work out. I study Reconstruction a lot. That never has many happy endings, still does. But I get inspiration from watching how people dealt with challenges in Methodism and in our wider culture as well. So a bicentennial for you guys and for all of us is a good time to reassess. Love what Jim wrote, but I'd still ask the question, why did Methodism get established up here? Why did people want a church or a Methodist society in this area? I didn't see in Jim's book where it said they were tired of going to Knoxville and the restaurants were better up here, and they wanted to argue about whether Fountain City was by a lake or a pond or any of those great discussions. Why did people think that Methodism needed to be part of this area? There were some reasons, and it wasn't just because the Baptists had a church and we wanted one too. There was a feeling like maybe folks needed that sense of grace that we found in Christ in this kind of unique, special way that we call Methodism. Methodism had been around in this area as early as the 1780s. The Holston Circuit was around since the 1780s. Jeremiah Lambert was the first circuit rider for the Holston Circuit, which basically included, it seemed, most of East Tennessee and Southwest Virginia. He lasted for 2 years, died in his 20s, around 1786. But as a conference, Holston's established in 1824. But that first conference in 1824, lifted up some of the fault lines that were going through Methodism and culture then that are still impacting us today. So I want to mention 2 things, and I'm trying to keep track of the time as well. First one is, one of the things we've always wrestled with, including in this area, we wrestled with it over the idea of race and slavery. So I want to simply say this. One example of that, Reverend John Tevis, who was the secretary of the 1824 conference, wrote all the notes on the 1824 conference. And then right at the end, he was the first journalist for Holston, if you will. Right at the end of that, he writes that he's transferring to the Kentucky Conference because he's an abolitionist. He didn't say that, but that's the reason he left, because he saw Holston is not holding up Wesley's rules against slavery in the way that he wanted to see that happen. The other thing that folks griped about, this may not be a surprise, but for years, people complained about their bishops. I don't know if that happens anymore, hopefully not, but we have a history of that. And people complained about bishops. Methodists complained about authority. Methodists complained about appointments. I don't know if that ever happened at Fountain City, but it certainly has at every other place at Holston Conference. And Asbury complained about a lot of things too. Salaries were complained about. And I love this quote. I'm going to read it from David Sullins. He's writing about salaries in the early church. And he says this. David Sullins was a very famous pastor out of the Bristol area. He said, "I don't believe that the question of our support," talking about salaries for preachers, "was ever discussed or mentioned. We had no assessment plan in those days." He's talking about the 1870s. "The old Methodist rule was about this. The people needed a preacher. The church sent them one. They were expected to take care of him, and he was expected to take what the people furnished him. If this fell short of meeting his needs, he was to look for the deficit when he got to heaven. It was never made up here." David Sullins was an interesting character as well. So the things we argue about today, we argued about back then. Asbury in particular wasn't a big fan of ministers getting married. He needed preachers. He needed single preachers who could be on a horse and ride their horses all the time on these incredibly long circuits that y'all have heard about. And so Asbury got mad, in effect, anytime some minister decided that maybe they wanted to have a family or settle down or retire. And most time you were burned out or ready to retire when you were about 28 or 30. Now you have to get in your 60s to do it. But back then, the superannuated preachers were fairly young by our measure. Asbury had friends still that had gotten married, but he writes in his journal in the early 1800s about Reverend Mark Whitaker, who was a Methodist minister in Southwest Virginia, who'd settled down, happily married, still an effective local preacher. But Asbury says, I enjoy the lodging at their house. And then he says this because he's talking about wishing that Reverend Whitaker had not gotten married. He says, I wish that his wife may not love him to death. And that was so the other fights were going on as well. And I want y'all to remember this as well. When we had our disaffiliation, how do we phrase that? The recent time of unpleasantness, when that happened a few years ago, I counted up, and some other historians did as well. This was our 23rd or 24th or 25th major fight in the Methodist Church since 1784. I'm going to take some money. I keep talking about doing this, but for our conference archives and history at conference next year, I think we're going to have a bumper sticker that says United Methodism, mad about something since 1784. It'll be suitable for your cars. We'll bring it around to churches. Church conferences start, or the First General Conference is held in 1784. By 1793, the first major split happens in Methodism as a fellow named John O'Kelly leads 1,000 Methodists out of Virginia to form something called the Republican Methodist Church. Their theme was not make Methodism great again or anything like that, but it was just simply, it was a church that didn't want bishops. He didn't like bishops. Wesley wasn't sure Asbury needed to be a bishop. In fact, he wrote letters to Asbury, and I've always said Francis Asbury, but evidently to folks who knew him well, and I didn't know he was gone a few years before I showed up, but Wesley knew Asbury well, and he refers to him in the letters over and over as Frankie. That was his nickname. Frankie, why are you wanting to be a bishop? We're trying to, well, they argued about stuff like that. But the splits and the fights that happened over all these years reflected a couple things. Our cultural changes in the United States, because Methodism reflects American culture more than any other denomination, but it also, the fights were always over slavery, or the prohibition of slavery, or over power and bishops. There were other things we fought over, but those were the biggies. So no wonder we sing at conference, and we have for a long time, and when we would get together, and are we yet alive and see each other's face? Glory and thanks to Jesus give for his almighty grace. And then that line that I love from that hymn, what troubles have we seen, what mighty conflicts past, fightings without and fears within, since we assembled last. Now, in 15 minutes, I want to give you a couple of highlights from your own history. I run across these people all the time, and basically I will say again, for the history of Fountain City United Methodist Church, you should read, if I was still teaching history at UTC, I would have this be a required text. Read Jim Dougherty's article that you have, his history that you have on the table there. And then take some books here, so I don't have to carry them out either later. But one of the things that I found in the archives from your own history that's kind of neat, concerns, so there's a couple pastors and one lay person I want to end with. Gordon Sturkey, some of y'all remember Gordon. Married into the Lundy family, which I'm friends with a lot of folks in the Lundy family. They were more in Chattanooga, although the Lundys were all over the place. But Gordon Sturkey, who I don't think I ever personally met, but I feel like I know him well because in our archives in Athens, his wife made scrapbooks. We've got two things from him at least. We have a lot of sermons too. If you ever need a sermon, we got them. So call me. But Gordon Sturkey's wife made a scrapbook of every single appointment that he was at, and not just little scrapbooks, but big scrapbooks with all the cultural stuff that happened. It wasn't just, here's my husband's sermons, and he wonderful. In fact, I don't even see her mentioning things about sermons in there. It's more what was happening at church. Here were the plays. Here was this. Here was that. They did it when he was on a district. They did one for Fountain City. There's one for McFarland down in Rossville. I saw that one. One for Fountain City was neat. But the other thing that we have in the archives from Gordon Sturkey is a book, and I think he must have had an administrative assistant do this together. She had beautiful handwriting. But he wrote down in a book every sermon in his career that he ever preached, every sermon. the place it was preached, what the impact was of that sermon. I mean, it's an incredible book. And he also wrote the name down of everybody brought into the church, at least by baptism and maybe by membership, across his career. We have those things down there. They're pretty neat. And I'll talk about Gordon Sturkey again in a minute. I've mentioned I.P. Martin. John Bruner served here in 1850. I don't think any of y'all remember him that well, but he wrote a wonderful book that got him in a lot of trouble because he was president of Hiwassee College. And he wrote a book because he was so sad that the Methodist Church had split in the 1844, and then the Methodist Episcopal Church South denomination starting up in 1845. He wrote a book that got him in a lot of trouble. It was called Union of the Churches, and it was basically a book that said, can't we all get along? He wrote it in about 1870 or so. And the answer was no, we cannot get along. And it was kind of like, well, I was going to make a joke about Texas politics. There was but you know, being a moderate is hard in a lot of places. I'll just put it that way. And he got ostracized after writing this book. I brought a copy of it. It seems very, very interesting now, and not something that would cause a lot of hostility. But back then, people's feelings were pretty raw. One of your other pastors, I don't know much about him, but a fellow that served here from 1887 through 1890 was John Asbury Bilderback. I know his great nephew is a buddy of mine in Chattanooga. Anybody named Bilderback has come out of Monroe County. And I was looking at this last night, the list of ministers, and I wrote him, I said, hey, is this guy related to you? And the answer I got back was, yep. Because he had to put up with that anytime I find a Bilderback. I'm like, I'm speaking at this church. And so anyway, he said to tell you hello reluctantly. But anyway, and then two people I want to mention, then I'll close it for questions. The first one was somebody I alluded to earlier, and this was your pastor in 1838, William Carroll Graves, W.C. Graves. He was present at the 1824 annual conference, and I'll just read you this. He says, and this is quoted out of R.M. Price's histories from Holston. He said, W.C. Graves says, I recall well when the first session of annual conference was held. I was then about 9 years old. It was late in November of 1824. The session was held in the Red House in East Knoxville. Either then or before or afterwards, I formed the acquaintance of nearly all the preachers that were present on that occasion. Several of them were about my father's house during the session. 9 years old. He served here in 1838, but in 1824, he was there to see Holston start. That's pretty cool. But what's even cooler was his career. He started in the Methodist Episcopal Church until it split. He was a minister in the Methodist Episcopal Church, and then he stayed with the Methodist Episcopal Church South after the split, but he didn't leave much of a record in terms of his views on slavery. He had a son or two that fought on the Confederate side of the Civil War, but in 1865, when Holston's Methodist Episcopal denomination started back up again, when the Northern Methodists began, as you know, from 1845 to 1939, we had two Holston conferences, one Northern Methodist, one Southern Methodist. W.C. Graves joined the Northern Methodist. And it was interesting. He was also the editor of the newspaper for Holston for a number of years. Didn't publish much that was inflammatory. If we had time, I'd talk about William Brownlow, who definitely did publish stuff that was inflammatory, but Graves was pretty laid back on a whole lot of things. But it's interesting to see his changing views, at least from what I can ascertain, on race. Because he ended up being not only in the ME Church, but the ME South, and then he joined, because he was the presiding elder, which is the district superintendent at that time, of the Morristown district. And when the new part of the denomination for African Americans, the East Tennessee Conference, was established in Greenville at their first meeting, and this was a real tough meeting, because there'd been this dream that after the Civil War, African Americans and whites could worship together, and gradually it ran against just the prevailing social feelings down here, and things pulled apart a little bit. So the Northern Methodists said, we'll start something. We still want everybody to be in the same church, but we'll start a separate sort of sub-denomination. And the East Tennessee Conference started up. Its first meeting was in Greenville in 1880. W.C. Graves joined that conference. and he was a member of it for several years. His diaries are kept, and this is something I want to research a little bit more. His diaries are kept at Tennessee Wesley, and I've not looked through those yet. But fascinating person. Again, we've got his letters up here. You're welcome to look at from 1838 as well. But he was also the founder of a place called Morristown Seminary during that time, which you may have known as Morristown College, and was somebody that helped make that happen. So you see him kind of evolve over a period of time. One of the few people we have that belong to all these different parts of Holston history, and he was a pastor here. I want to end with one last person, and I'm hopefully oh gosh, I still have 7 minutes. Let the time flow. But anyway, we work a lot over at Norwood Church. Somehow I belong or work in 3 different churches. I don't know how that happens, but these days I'm just single-handedly trying to join every church in the conference, just keep Methodism all connected. That's my goal. And but we've been at Norwood for a long time. My wife and I both have a membership over there, and run a food ministry out there. Some of y'all have been involved with that. We love all that connectional stuff in all sorts of different ways. But it sits on a road called Merchant Road. Now, one of the things I'm curious about is why things get named the way they do. And sometimes there's not a reason. There's a subdivision in Chattanooga called Whispering Pines that doesn't have a single tree on the property. I mean, I know those kind of things, but that always makes me laugh a little bit. But I thought Merchant Road, well, there are a lot of businesses over there on the Clinton Highway and this and that. Must be that. Turns out, this may have been one of Jack Neely's columns I was reading, or somehow the Knoxville News Shopper or something like that. But one of the history columns said Merchant Road was named, there's just a little paragraph, named after Mr. Merchant, who was the father of Jane Merchant, a noted local poet. And I thought, Jane Merchant, who's that? I started reading up on Jane Merchant. Wow. Now, I'll admit my bias. A lot of times, and my poetry's not that good either. A lot of times when somebody says, I wrote a little praise poem, and I don't want to downplay, but sometimes it's, they could maybe have a little heft to them, or something's missing, or it's kind of whatever. Jane Merchant's a really cool poet. Wrote about 15 books. And some of y'all know her story and all that. She grew up in Jefferson County for about 10 years, was born outside of Dandridge, moved over here. Her father was a member at Inskip Church, the old Inskip Church, and she and her mother, at least, maybe their father too, are buried at Bookwalter. But she was a member of Fountain City. And but she, with rare exception, now Gordon Sturkey, I think, took her around on a road trip one time, and there was a funeral home that had this kind of vehicle that could take her around. But she had a disease, brittle bone, I believe it was, and y'all can correct me later if I'm wrong on that. There's all sorts of the family's got a website up about her and some other stuff. But she pretty much lived in a house in Fountain City. Her mom took care of her. She looked out a window at the world. That was her world, her view. She couldn't move, couldn't get out of bed, but talk to people. She was deaf by the time she got in her 20s, but she corresponded with folks all over the world. Wrote some of the most top-selling books of Christian devotion poetry that Abbott and Cokesbury have ever done. They had a whole run of her books in the 40s, 50s, 60s. She died in the early 70s. But what I found interesting about her, and Gordon Sturkey did her funeral. I've actually got the book he used to do that service, which was really neat. We've got some of his books at the archives as well. But she wrote about, she didn't write things just to uplift. She wrote about social issues as well. And I'm been really, in fact, I've got, if somebody wants to borrow it, there's one biography written of her that's really neat. Ruth Bell Graham did the foreword for it, which is pretty cool too. But anyway, she wrote this poet wrote some interesting poems right after Hitler invaded the Czech Republic, or Czechoslovakia, and Poland in the 1939. She wrote a poem called Memorandum to Youth. And it says, it is not in gay banners that flaunt a crimson sky, nor in a drum's quick throbbing, nor bugle's keen swift cry, nor in the pride of marching men that war's essentials lie, but in the red fields where horror screams and youth lies rotting with its dreams. That's not what I normally find in uplifting devotional material. I mean, she writes some hard-hitting stuff. And then this one other point. And this, she was very concerned about how we were dealing with or not dealing with integration and building, you know, I don't know if she corresponded with Dr. King, but she paid attention to all these things that were going on as she lived through the 60s. And this poem's called Sayings. It was written in 61 from a book called Blessed Are You. They say he let a Negro ride and even called him sir. They say she let that colored girl sit down and eat with her. They say they're letting city kids vacation on their farm. They say that one of them's been in jail. They'll do a lot of harm. They say he visits old man Jones, wild as he is and queer. They say they want a lot of friends. Well, they won't find many here. They say it's getting on their nerves the way we stay away. Yet they seem happy with it all. At least that's what they say. I am moved by the stories that sometimes surprise me. People will say, where do you get your inspiration from when we are starting different ministries or doing outreaches or different things like that? And a lot of times I hate to tell them, but it said, I found this in a book from 1840 or from a deaconess in the 1920s who, because Southwest Virginia was full of people who spoke Italian, in places like, as they call it now, Daney up in Southwest Virginia, deaconesses and preachers' spouses who learned Italian to reach out to people. You find these stories, and those are things I don't want to forget. Don't want to forget some of this poetry. Don't want to forget the other things that kind of lift us up. So congratulations. Happy birthday. Francis Asbury's 280 today. Y'all are only 200, but you're catching up. And I appreciate you letting me come in and meander in your history for just a little bit. And thank you, Jim. If you've got questions, I'll take it. I know y'all need to be out of the building by 11, but but I will say that I'll stick around. I even found a book called How to Be a Pastor. So if you've got anybody that, no, okay, but I would be glad to talk to any of y'all about this. Love for you to take any books on this table, including I brought a whole box of the Holston histories in too, free of charge. And you'll just help my back pain of not carrying that out. So, all right. I'll stick around. No.
Does anybody have a question that they'd like to toss? I have one for you. So you are a significant historian for Holston Conference, and well, okay, that'll work. Without the glitter. Well, I wonder, based on, and this may be a tough question, but based on your understanding of the Holston Conference, how for 200 years, you talked about how there's been different conflicts that have come up and down, and how the conference has still made a way. I wonder if you would want to name anything that you've noticed, characteristics that have helped the conference make a way through challenging conflicts. Could you say something?
That's a great question, and I think our ability, we've learned how to tolerate each other from time to time. That sounds kind of lame, but you can go into not Knoxville as much as some other cities. I think Greenville, Clinton, other places where back in the day you could go in and there were 3 churches within a block of each other. Evangelical United Brethren, who I've not talked about much, and others. And so one of the things I think Holston made a way because we sort of figured we had now there's some issues we didn't make a great way on, like involving race for the most part, but in terms of some of the other issues, we made a way because we were close enough, we were in close proximity and had learned over and over how to sort of tolerate each other enough to sometimes even listen to each other. I see that with the conference colleges. If we had more time, I'd tell you more about the history of Tennessee Wesleyan and what's now UTC in Chattanooga that was called U.S. Grant University. Gives you an idea of who might have founded that university after the war, but how how they kind of tried to figure out how to build community in that area. The Northern Methodists had come in, give to me at least gives that's one of the examples. I don't think that's a really great answer to what, but and lately I think one thing that I've seen, and maybe I've just read the fun people, but I think having a sense of humor helps. The places where Holston has suffered the most have been, especially during the Civil War, when we've had people who have been autocratic bishops without a sense of humor. Bishop Early comes to mind, several other folks. So the places where I've seen us make a way and have been when people actually were able to listen to each other a little bit. Last couple of years, I'm not sure. It's been a tough time. We've not always listened real well to each other, but I'm also seeing, oddly enough, even in this time, at least in Chattanooga, I'm seeing some interesting things where people are starting to cross back over some lines again. I'll leave it at that.